So precision agriculture is about optimizing the way you do farming, essentially, right? Because when you look at farming in general, especially when even small scale or large scale, there's a lot of wastage around and there's a lot of art rather than science around it. So what we're looking at is data-driven agriculture. What does that mean? To give you an example, if you put fertilizers, there are specific times where they can be a lot more effective due to rainfall, when it happened, and how much coverage you can have. So one of the things that we provide, and based on the experience we have with FarmBeats, for example, we can marry a satellite data, a weather information, so that a farmer can know the slope of the land and then when the next rainfall is going to be, to make sure that when they fertilize, it's not going to heavily downpour and then just waste everything away.
And this is the bit that interests me about the FarmBeats program and why I asked for this conversation is exactly that. I thought initially, why is Microsoft involved in agriculture? But the common point here is data. And taking the data from the farm, putting it into a digital format and a digital system that yields results that can make agriculture more efficient, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting is if you think about the FarmBeats and the journey that my colleague has gone through from research, there was various components that made it not as simple as it sounds, right? Because yes, we have the technology to have the sensors embedded, and we can do that when it's a very connected world. But when you're out in the farms, there is hardly any connectivity. What happened to electricity, right? And then what happened to how much sensors can you put in, and how do they degrade over time? So these are a lot of the things that they actually spend a lot of time on. So if you look at the solution that they come up with and part of the amalgamation of all these different areas, we actually leverage a number of existing technology at that time to innovate in this space. So one is around connectivity. So
before we break it down into parts, let me just again put it in context here, because for a farmer, the idea of collecting data through sensors, through satellites, or through drones, or through measurement is something that isn't part of their daily life. And interacting with technology from Microsoft is equally something they probably wouldn't do it. And what's really interesting about this is the combinatorial innovation that this FarmBeats product has delivered, which is just taking little pieces of technology that are everyday and commonplace, and in some cases reasonably affordable, and putting them together in a way that works. And let me begin with the affordability prospect first, because for any farmers listening or for any people listening who are thinking, okay, this might be valuable, the idea of putting sensors on your farm, the idea of flying drones over your land and taking pictures would seem to be an expensive process. So just tell me about how this system, as you've integrated all those components, is it practicable? Is it something that ordinary farmers can apply to?
I think it's practicable. It will probably depend on the yield and the span and the type of crop that you have. So again, taking the example of the journey of the FarmBeats, that actually got deployed in India, and part of a whole part of the solution, the problem space that they need to solve was power, for example. That's part of the reason they package it up in a ruggedized container using pretty low-cost sensor devices, and more importantly, integrated into solar, right? Because they know there is no electrical connectivity out there in the farm, and it's not viable to kind of pull electricity along. Affordability, I think it's going to be measured based on the return of the investment that you have as well. So the yield of improvement, that will probably cover what you have, right? Because we can't just measure the cost of something from the pure cost. But if you can cover that within a short space of time through increased productivity, I would say that would probably make it more affordable.
All right, so what we've got then is a bunch of technologies, and let's just dip into each of them, that you've brought together to allow farmers to better understand their needs of their particular patch of land and how they can optimize that. So the first thing is collecting the data. How do you do that?
So the data, I think there's several areas of places that you can do, right? One, if you don't have sensors in place, we can go back to what I mentioned before. Essentially, there are satellite data available, there are land slope information, and there's weather information that's generally available. Farmers can actually take advantage of this pretty much off the bat, and that's part of the reason the FarmBeats exists. And if you look at our current offering in preview, we took all of that and make it a lot easier to start with those basic building blocks. Right?
So collating data from weather reports and stuff that are already out there.
Correct, and then just narrowing down to your particular patch of land so that you understand what is the topology of the land and when is what kind of weather patterns, when is the best time potentially to fertilize or to plant crops. I think that's probably the first protocol. Not much investment, and that's easy to do. And the good thing is, once you start seeing that, hey, my fertilizer is kicking in, you probably want to know a little bit more about your plant health life and how much water is actually in a specific plot. That's when you start inserting things like sensors in place, which is a bit heavier investment.
Okay, so you put sensors into the ground, and then how do you connect those up? And is that enough? How many sensors do you need? What is the process?
So the number of sensors you need will, again, depends on the type of crops that you have and then the density, etc. But typically, you would have moisture, acidity level type of sensor. These are the common ones, and they're not really expensive. Part of the cost will be how do you deploy it, and then how do you actually package it up so that it works for your farm.
And one of the interesting things I read is that you actually don't need that many sensors because you've developed software algorithms, various systems whereby just a few sensors can actually build up a picture, and a very accurate picture of what's happening in other places where there aren't any sensors.
Yeah, that's part of the beauty about leveraging machine learning and historical data, because based on the pattern, it is quite linear or predictable, I would say, once you know a few points, what in between those points are actually happening. I would say it's not going to be 100% accurate because there's probably going to be always abnormalities and special circumstances, but in general, in a lot of cases, it's more than adequate.
Okay, so you've got the sensors in the ground, and you talked earlier on about solar power. Presumably these are being powered by solar because maybe in major rural areas in developing countries, they're not going to have electricity out in the fields. So you power those by solar. And the next problem is how do you actually collect that data, and how do you transmit it to somewhere where it can be received and used, because presumably connectivity is not going to be great in those parts of the world either.
Yes. So there's two ways. So one is what I mentioned before about TV white spaces. Essentially, this was the technology that we took advantage of a number of years ago.
Let's just define TV white space. What you're talking about is old-style broadcast technology through the airways, UHF, VHF, where you tune into a bandwidth.
Correct. But essentially, when we say TV white space, is leveraging that frequency, right? It's in the megahertz instead of the gigahertz where we are now. So they're not very fast, but they can go long distances. But this is government-regulated frequency, just like in the mobile space. So what's important is to make sure that the government is in the loop, which they are in these countries, and they've actually identified specific frequencies that come in. So a lot of the smarts is actually in just knowing what frequency to use in that particular area, because otherwise it might be occupied by TV channel 1, and then another in the city might be occupied by 10 other channels.
Okay, so you get past the problem of lack of Wi-Fi connectivity by using existing broadcast spectrum to transmit the signal to a receiving station, but then how does the farmer use the data that's collected? Or presumably they're going to need to connect it to Microsoft or some software in the cloud that will help them make sense of that data.
Yeah, so that's part of the reason. If you look at the way we look at cloud from a number of years ago, and this is based on our experience in doing things like FarmBeats and also in manufacturing, we realized that just having everything and assuming everything needs to be processed in a big cloud in the middle is not really viable, because there are scenarios where we need to push information and maybe contain the information at the edge and then process it at the edge more locally, but then just have some of the summary information coming through so that you still get an overall view of what's happening, but you don't necessarily get burdened with all the information. If you have so many sensors and you have really low bandwidth connectivity to your central cloud, it's not going to be viable down the road. You want to be able to react pretty quickly on those information and alert the farmers for potential. For example, if you want to start integrating videos, monitoring like leaf colors, etc., if you can process that at the edge, you cut a lot of bandwidth out.
All right, so you've basically gotten over most of the significant problems here, which is data gathering, data connectivity, and data processing. And all of this is easily available to farmers. I mean, you've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now, right? So you have a system in place that is fairly accessible. How do you present this to farmers? I mean, how can you scale this technology? How can you persuade the developing country agricultural sector to say, right, here's something that we can really use?
Yeah, I think the ecosystem, even though we have the technology, the deployment at scale, it's always been a challenge. So I think this is where developing an ecosystem and partnerships with a number of different organizations, for example, an NGO, where do you get the funding for this, and the government from a legislation point of view is critical to get things at scale, right? Because The gap that we see, we have partners that can actually have sensor information, satellite information, and we took this in our central cloud and made it into an offering. But at the end of the day, someone still needs to help the farmers. In the developed world, we're starting to see a lot of the farmers becoming more tech savvy. So they're adopting this and they have the infrastructure and the funding because they can justify it from their business. But in a more less developed country where the farmers maybe just passing by on their crop, this is an area where I think that partnership and the ecosystem is going to be very important.
An educational component.
Correct.
What scale of benefit do they get from using this technology in terms of their output, in terms of the management of the farm?
I think it's just more data-driven instead of just being the art. You got to remember, the farmers, some of the very experienced ones may take a number of years to be able to understand their land really well. But over time, land actually changes as well in soil composition and they degrade. The case in India, for example, we actually help improve the efficiency of the yield of the crop. Even if you have the same yield, but imagine if you can cut the fertilizer use by 20%, right? These are things that you probably can't measure unless you have the data behind it to be able to optimize it and comfortably say, I've reduced the fertilizer and yet I'm still having the same yield. Or can I actually improve the timing of when I apply this at reduced rate, but then get even more yield?